Step 3 in our process is to identify the test statistic. Now for us here in chapter 10, what that largely means is, should we use the Z statistic or the T statistic? And that decision is going to come or going to follow directly as it did in chapter 9. Now this process, the 6-step process, is more general than what we're covering here in chapter 10. And in fact, we'll see some other choices that we have to make in chapter 11. So there'll be a couple other decisions to make at this step 3 process, or step 3 of the process. But for now, really what we're deciding upon is, do we know the population standard deviation or not? And as we talked about in chapter 9, there's a lot of scenarios where we probably wouldn't know the population standard deviation. The logic being, if you're looking for the population mean, you probably also don't have the information of the standard deviation. Now, that generally holds true in chapter 10, but we do have a few more scenarios or kind of a broader window in which we may know the population standard deviation. And our chopstick example here is potentially one of those. So if we're working on a production line and we're churning out thousands of chopsticks, we likely have a pretty good feel for what the standard deviation is. And so we probably have a pretty solid value that we can plug in there. And we don't need to rely upon the sample standard deviation. So in that sense, there's a maybe we know that the population standard deviation is something like 0.1 centimeters. And so we can use that in our calculations and stick with the Z statistic. Okay, and so we will use our familiar Z statistic in step 4 and then in step 5. And so again, what we're eventually going to do is take a sample mean, compare it to this hypothesized mean, and then of course put it into a context of the spread, the standard deviation. And so again, this is going to be sample, and so this is related to we need to take into account the sample size, but we are going to stick with the Z statistic in this case. Now, of course, there's going to be plenty of times when we don't know the standard deviation, and this could be we were looking at that other example where there was a claim by a politician that average income was $52,000 or greater, and we were comparing that, the alternative hypothesis being that it was less than. And so in this scenario, we probably don't know the population standard deviation, and so we will go ahead and use the T statistic, which, just like in previous chapters, we're just altering by using S, right? Or this is the reason we're switching to the T statistic, is because we need to estimate the population standard deviation with the sample standard deviation. So again, we'll crunch the sample standard deviation when we take the sample mean and go from there. So really kind of mirrors chapter 9. We have to decide if we want to use Z or T, or really it's not as much of a decision here as what we're forced to use if we need to. Okay, so again, more broadly, this is going to have more decisions as we move forward into chapter 11. But this is the step where we're basically, what we need to do is take into account what have we done in step 1 and 2, and what kind of a statistic will give us the ability to test the hypothesis in step 1.